Does anyone want to comment on that? Anne, Molly?
Well, I actually would like to just draw our attention to some of the wonderful chat that we have going on here. And so Wendy Luttrell says here, adding to Corin's normalization of health inequalities, the normalization of early death for Black lives in the US. I think this whole question of what becomes this sort of normalized story and the effect of it is really, really very powerful. Wendy, I wondered if you would like to say anything more about that or just leave the comment as it is. There's a lot of wonderful comments in the chat as well.
Well, now that you've called it out, thank you. But and I was just going to leave it, but I do think it relates to something that was discussed earlier about certain intersecting narratives that that are happening, and not by accident. So that, you know, in the heat of COVID, we also have the resurrection of Black Lives Matter and the intensification of it with the hoped for message that early death of Black lives is what the movement is about, and that racism, structural racism in the United States, if not all over the place, is defined by early mortality and the actual governmental choices made to sustain that. So it's surprisingly and shockingly, but almost anticipatory that this normalization would keep going in COVID, and that even with the stark numbers, there has just not been a way to make the called out argument that resources have to really be thrown at this very specifically. That just is not happening.
Thank you, Wendy. Sharon, do you have another question, or is just the sign is on? Okay. Right. Okay. The next.
Could I just ask you something, because I'm also looking in the chat here. I was wondering if we could ask Mira Yuval Davis, who has been running a series of really, really wonderful seminars during this pandemic. And Mira, would you mind saying a few words here just about frontline and the implications of borders during the COVID crisis, which has been the theme throughout your wonderful seminar series?
Thanks, Molly. And our next webinar is going to be about imposing structures of racism during the pandemic in Britain on February the 3rd. So I'm hoping many of you will able to attend. But I also wanted to mention intersecting narratives, but from kind of the other direction. I think when Boris Johnson and his mate came to power, they had already the narrative of their government already for the Brexit, and they thought that it is all going to be nice and smooth. And when the COVID started to happen, they also tried to subdue it to the same kind of narrative. And the whole narrative of frontline, at least in the first round, I think now when things are completely out of control, that's it's a little bit of a different story. But in the first one was nationalization and militarization of the COVID crisis. So that in a way, going back to some things that Anne was saying, that and the whole question of the use of COVID as a cover, that on the one hand, there was the nationalist story, we are all in it together, and at the same time, this was used to cover the erosion of democracy and the cronyism and all the privatization without any accountability of the contract, which led us to this horrible situation of the total failure of the supposed world-beating Tess and Trace. And at the same time, the whole narrative of Frontline covered also a very central ambiguity, which is at the heart of Brexit. Because on the one hand, the people in the front line were national heroes, but at the same time, many of them were not part of the nation. They did not belong. And their whole kind of status, although there were, of course, a lot of pressure and there was suspension of some rights of some of them, but we know that all the deportations, all the family having to continue to pay for the NHS in which the families themselves continue to work, let alone other services and key services. And of course, also the fact of that people talk about the racialization of inequalities and the fact that the front line really were embodied most of it, not only by racialized minorities, but very often people who were not part of the nation, but were part of the civil society. So we see all this kind of ambiguity, and how the processes of everyday bordering continue to operate at the same time in which, of course, as they understand the compliance of the guidelines and the legitimacy of their rule is at the basis of how they can keep on going. So we do see a lot of very interesting in the Chinese curse way, of course, of contesting narratives about what is going on now.
Thanks, Nira. That's great. Masi, over to you.
Okay. This what Nira just mentioned leads us to a question on political activism. I would like to take you back to the beginning of the pandemic last year around this time, that given the limitations of not being able to meet each other or to gather in a place, political activism would be affected. Do you think we have seen new forms of activism emerging, or do you think that activism, because of COVID, has affected quite negatively? So we'll start with Molly, maybe?
Okay, so thank you, Masi. That's such a challenging question. Some of you were kind enough to get up very, very early in the morning, US time, when I was living in Helsinki, and I gave a paper in a conference, in a series that Anne Phoenix was organizing. And it was in the very beginning of the pandemic, and I actually spoke about the challenges for political activism in the context of not being able to meet together, and what would happen, and looking at a number of ways in which different already existing groups of activists, for instance, not only Hong Kong was one of the most pronounced, where people who were already politically organized, in a sense, those ties and those communication channels and the Be Like Water was recommissioned actually in the service of the pandemic. But that also happened all around the place. In many, many countries, already existing community efforts were actually used then to respond to the pandemic. But I have to say that looking back, this is that narrative imagination thing, because looking back to when I gave that paper, and some of you were part of that group there, I could never, ever have imagined the enormity of what we witnessed this summer, which in the Black Lives Matter mobilization around the world. And I think that actually, you know, the ways in which new forms of political activism have happened, they need to happen, But I think that, and I do think that some people have been extraordinarily creative in finding ways that are both safe and effective. I mean, I live in East London, and one of the most remarkable things to me when I first returned here was the powerful graffiti that is all over the place, even while this is one of the most bruised, damaged places in the country in terms of the virus. The creative expression about this has been enormous. But I also think that just back to that thing about COVID as cover, I think that it's very frightening to see how much political dissent has been effectively silenced and blocked by prohibitions which are ostensibly about COVID, but really are not. So I think that this tale, we're still in the eye of the storm. There's still much to tell, but I think that it's I think that there are new and emerging forms of political activism, even while others are being shut down. I think I'll end here because not least I'm really interested to hear what Jill will have to say about that in South Africa.
Thanks, Molly. Well, I think that, you know, the obvious kind of like response in terms of what activism has been possible is around the internet space. And so the possibilities for us to talk with one another across geographical spaces online is incredibly powerful. And I speak as a person who's not on any social media platforms, and really find it quite an alienating sort of space. And it does feel as if that space for organizing, for activism, belongs to the young. And there have been remarkable experiences of the ways in which young people have used those platforms in very productive ways. We also know, of course, that these spaces are problematic in two ways. Firstly, that they are privileged spaces. So those of us who are able to be in this room together this afternoon or this morning or wherever you are in the time zone, I mean, this is a remarkable privilege, and it is amazing that we can learn from our different contexts and engage with one another. But for the vast majority of the world, this room is not open. And we sometimes forget that. It feels so kind of ordinary for us that we forget that for most people, it doesn't exist. That even taking into account other social media kinds of platforms, which of course have far greater reach than this one. But the second is I suppose, the obvious thing, that these tools can also be used for fascist purposes. And we need no further kind of like evidence of that than what has happened in the US in recent weeks. So I think that activism has both been, I suppose, kind of contained or restrained through the pandemic, but possibly also there are kind of new possibilities that we have to be creative with. So then I just wanted to also add something about this idea of mobility and migration and borders, because I think it's very important. And the ways in which the COVID story has really turned, well, it was right from the beginning, but I suppose has mutated, that the story of the threat of COVID is about the other. And that there are all kinds of ways in which the thinking around who it is that is a threat to who and in what context is being mobilized. So again, to give an example from my context, because I think it's important that maybe your contexts are more visible to me than mine is to you on a daily basis. Just before Christmas, we were in what was called lockdown level 1. which meant basically that most things were functioning in a relatively normal way. There were still some restrictions, a curfew at night, some kind of restraints in terms of certain kinds of activities. But in general, the things were relatively open, including that just before Christmas, which is standard in South Africa, people go to their traditional rural homes, and in particular, cross-border migration for work is very standard in South Africa. So in particular from countries like Mozambique or Malawi, and very, very definitely from Zimbabwe. So many people returned home just before Christmas. Immediately after Christmas, before New Year, the government introduced a new lockdown level 3. This indeed, in terms of the kind of movement of the pandemic and the spread of the virus, is sensible, and most of us support these increased restrictions. However, what this has in effect done is closure of borders, so that many people who are dependent on work in South Africa have been unable to return. Possibly people without work papers or other kinds of documentation that's required, including, for example, a negative COVID test, which is almost impossible to get in Zimbabwe. So we have this kind of movement in terms of who it's possible to blame. So yes, individual blaming is certainly happening. Individual people must take responsibility for their behavior, but also group blaming, that there are categories of persons who are being othered in relation to the pandemic in deeply disturbing ways. So I suppose in our context, it's kind of a reflection of what's happening with Brexit and what has been happening in the US for a very long time, the kind of way of trying to create a kind of enclosure of the good and the safe, and to exclude all others.
Thank you. Anne?
Sorry, I was expecting to come after Kathy as usual.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry, Kathy.
Shall I go, or yeah?
May I say something?
Yes. Sorry, Anne. Kathy, if you can start.
Sure, I won't take long, and Mark has already in the chat introduced this topic, but I was going to say it even earlier. I want to take issue a little bit with the idea that political activism has been silenced. We saw a dreadful, shameful example of political activism a week ago, last Wednesday, at the US Capitol. And I've come to embrace a term that some journalist introduced. I wish I could find the source of this. This was an example of performative violence. And the white men, mostly, some white women, who stormed the Capitol, taking selfies, knowing that there were cameras all over the place that were recording them, were constructing narratives about themselves and their movements. And it's intimately related to COVID because many of them don't believe in COVID. Certainly most were not wearing masks or not wearing them correctly. And they endangered a number of people, including US lawmakers who had to sequester with other lawmakers who refused to wear their masks. So we are seeing political activism on the right, both among elected officials in our country, as well as among segments of the population. And I just, I plead for good work to be done on this. The kind of research that was done at CNR on the relationship between social movements and narrative. Just this situation in the US cries out for analysis. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kathy. Anne?
Thank you. And oh, sorry, Ruth wanted to say something.
Yeah, sorry. Look, this might be taking things off in a direction that you're not interested. You don't want to cover. But it is one of the reasons I came today, and it kind of fits in with Kathy's example. Because this is a narrative psychology conference, and so I'm interested in the relationship between narrative and psychology. And this example that Kathy gave of this massive mobilisation based on lies, Trump's lies, but the power of narrative to, you could take those people to a COVID ward and they still would not believe in COVID. This is the power of these narratives to actually override any confrontation with facts. People are being confronted with the facts now, but 70 million people still voted for Trump. So what I'm interested in here is this relationship between narrative, political agendas or political actions in the case of the invasion of the Capitol, and the obliteration of any requirement for any fact, and the psychology about that. You know, to understand the psychology around that.
Okay, that's thanks a lot. I think that's in continuation of